When I was little, my parents sent me to a daycare in our small town. It was a cozy place with cheerful walls painted in bright colors, shelves full of toys, and a big backyard for us to play in. Miss Linda, the main daycare worker, was a kind woman who always greeted us with a warm smile. The kids adored her, and she always seemed to have endless patience. But early on, I made an unusual friend at daycare. He was a quiet kid named Tommy, who hardly ever joined the other kids when they played games. I noticed him sitting alone in the corner one day, so I went over and asked if he wanted to play. He didn't say anything at first, just gave me a strange look, but eventually he nodded. After that, we became inseparable. Tommy had this odd way about him, quiet but intense, always watching everything with wide, careful eyes. One day, as we were building a block tower together, Tommy looked at me very seriously and whispered, "You need to be careful around Miss Linda." I laughed, thinking he was joking. Miss Linda was one of the nicest people I knew, always giving us treats and playing games with us. But Tommy just shook his head and whispered again, "Don't let her get you alone." The warning felt strange, but I didn't pay much attention to it. I thought maybe Tommy was just shy around adults. But after that day, he kept giving me little warnings here and there. If Miss Linda offered to take me to the back room to find a toy, Tommy would grab my arm and insist I stay. If she suggested we go inside for snacks while the other kids stayed outside, Tommy would whisper, "It's not safe." I started to get nervous. I was too young to understand what Tommy meant, but his warnings planted a seed of fear. One afternoon, when most of the kids were napping, Miss Linda came over to me and asked if I wanted to help her set up for snack time in the kitchen. I froze, remembering Tommy's warnings. I shook my head, mumbling something about wanting to play outside, and she just smiled and told me I could go. When I told Tommy about it later, he looked relieved. He said, "Don't go anywhere alone with her, okay?" I promised him I wouldn't. Weeks went by, and I started noticing odd things. Sometimes I'd see Miss Linda talking to kids in low voices, her hand resting heavily on their shoulders as she whispered something I couldn't hear. The kids she talked to always seemed different afterward, quieter, nervous, like they were afraid of something. But they never talked about it, just glanced over at Miss Linda with wide eyes and quickly looked away. One day, Tommy wasn't at daycare. I asked the other kids if they knew where he was, but they just shrugged. The next day, he wasn't there again. Miss Linda told me he'd moved away, but I didn't believe her. There was no goodbye, no explanation, just gone. I missed him, but mostly I missed the feeling of safety he gave me. Without him, I felt exposed, like Miss Linda's gaze lingered on me just a little too long. One afternoon, Miss Linda asked if I wanted to help her with a special project in the back room. She said I was her favorite helper, her special little friend. I wanted to say no, but without Tommy's reassuring presence, I couldn't find the courage. I felt my legs moving as if they were on autopilot, following her down the narrow hallway. The room she led me to was small and dark, filled with boxes and old toys. She closed the door behind us, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. Her smile seemed different, sharper somehow, as she bent down to my level. I felt trapped, my heart pounding as I remembered all of Tommy's warnings, and then I heard it, a whisper, faint but clear. It sounded like Tommy's voice. He was saying my name, urgently, like he was trying to get my attention. I turned toward the door, and for a split second, I thought I saw him standing there, looking right at me with that same serious expression. I felt a surge of courage, like he was giving me strength, and without thinking, I bolted for the door. I pushed past Miss Linda, threw open the door, and ran as fast as I could back to the main room. She called after me, her voice tight and sharp, but I didn't stop. I hid in the play area, trembling, until my parents came to pick me up. I never told them what happened, just begged them to let me stay home instead of going back to daycare. Years later, I found out the truth. Miss Linda was arrested for something terrible, something that made my skin crawl. She had been hurting kids for years, but she always made sure they were too afraid to tell anyone. Thinking back to my time at the daycare, I realized just how lucky I was. I never saw Tommy again, and no one seemed to remember him. I looked through old photos from that time, searching for any trace of him, but there was nothing. I still don't know who or what Tommy was, but I'll always be grateful for his warnings, his quiet presence, and his watchful eyes. Growing up, I was a quiet kid with a vivid imagination. My parents thought it was cute how I'd spend hours talking to my toys or making up stories about fairies in the backyard. Our house was in a peaceful neighborhood, the kind where kids rode their bikes in the street and everyone knew each other. It was an older house with creaky floors and an attic that I'd never dared to explore. But what stands out most in my memories isn't the house itself, it's the strange friend I made there. It started when I was around 6 years old. I was playing in my room one afternoon, arranging my stuffed animals in a circle, when I felt a prickling sensation, as if someone was watching me. I glanced toward the door, but no one was there. Then I heard a voice, soft and kind, asking if I wanted to play. I looked around, confused, until I saw him. He was sitting in the corner of my room, a boy around my age with dark hair and old-fashioned clothes. He smiled at me, and somehow I wasn't scared. I asked him his name, and he said he was Sam. From that day on, Sam became my best friend. I talked about him all the time, telling my parents about the games we played and the things he said. They thought he was an imaginary friend, just a product of my overactive imagination. They would laugh it off whenever I mentioned him, even when I told them how he'd beaten me at hide, and Seeker made funny faces to cheer me up. But to me, Sam was as real as anyone else. Sam was different from the other kids at school. He never made fun of me, never got bored of playing the same games, and always listened to my stories. Sometimes he'd tell me about his life, though his stories were strange. He talked about a time before TVs and cars, describing how his family used to travel in a horse-drawn carriage and light their house with candles. I didn't really understand, but I liked listening to him. Sam had a way of making the past sound magical. One night, things changed. I was in bed, half asleep, when I felt a weight on the edge of my bed. I opened my eyes and saw Sam sitting there, staring at me with an intensity that made me shiver. He looked sad, almost as if he was about to cry. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me he had to go somewhere I couldn't follow. I begged him not to leave, but he just shook his head. He said he didn't belong here anymore, and that he'd stayed too long already. Before I could say anything else, he leaned over, whispered goodbye, and vanished. The next morning, I told my parents about Sam leaving. They looked at each other, clearly relieved, and said I was just growing out of my imaginary friend phase. But I knew better. Sam had been real as anyone else, and I missed him terribly. The house felt emptier without him, the shadows in my room darker, the silence more profound. Years went by, and I grew up, eventually pushing the memory of Sam to the back of my mind. I convinced myself it had all been in my imagination, a story my younger self had created. But one day when I was 16, I decided to finally explore the attic. I'd always avoided it, partly because it was dusty and dark, but mostly because it gave me a strange, uneasy feeling. Armed with a flashlight, I climbed the narrow stairs and pushed open the attic door. The air was thick with dust, and the light barely pierced the darkness. As I looked around, my beam caught on something in the corner. It was an old wooden box, worn and covered in cobwebs. Curious, I opened it, finding a stack of yellowed papers and a small framed photograph. When I held the photo to the light, my breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of a young boy, around 6 or 7, with dark hair and old-fashioned clothes. His eyes held that same sad, knowing look I remembered from so long ago. It was Sam. I dug through the papers, my hands shaking. There were letters and records all mentioning a family who had lived in the house decades before. I found an obituary for a boy named Samuel, who had passed away at the age of 7. The date was from the early 1900s. I read the obituary over and over, feeling the chill seep into my bones. Sam had been real. He had lived in this house and died long before I was born, yet somehow he had found his way back, reaching out to a lonely child who needed a friend. I put the photo back in the box, my mind reeling. All the memories of Sam flooded back, the games we played, his strange stories, the way he'd said goodbye that night. I realized that he hadn't just been an imaginary friend, he had been a spirit, lingering in a world he no longer belonged to. After that, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the attic. I left the box where I'd found it, as if disturbing it any further would break some fragile connection to the past. But sometimes, late at night, I'd feel that familiar prickling sensation, as if someone was watching me, making sure I was okay. And in those moments I knew Sam was still with me, a silent guardian watching from the shadows, never truly gone. I grew up in a house that sat at the edge of a dense forest. It was the kind of place that seemed alive, with creaking floorboards and whispers of wind seeping through the old, rattling windows. My mom said it had character, and that living so close to nature would teach me to be independent and brave. For the most part, I loved it there. I'd explore the forest, collect rocks and leaves, and make forts out of fallen branches. But what stands out most in my memories isn't the house itself. It's the strange friend I made there. I was around 7 when I first met her. It was a late autumn afternoon, and I was playing by myself at the edge of the trees, kicking around piles of fallen leaves. That's when I noticed someone standing just inside the forest, half hidden behind a tree. She was a girl, maybe a year or two older than me, with long black hair and a pale, thin face. She didn't say anything, just watched me. Feeling brave, I waved and she lifted a hand in response. The next day, she was there again, in the exact same spot. I asked her name, but she didn't answer. She just smiled and motioned for me to follow her into the forest. I hesitated. Mom always told me not to go too far into the woods alone, but there was something about the girl that made me curious. I stepped forward, and she turned and drifted deeper into the trees, glancing back to make sure I was following. We walked for what felt like hours. She never spoke, only looked back to smile at me. Eventually, we reached a small clearing. The sun filtered through the branches, casting a warm light over a circle of mushrooms in the grass. The girl knelt beside them, motioning for me to do the same. She pointed at the mushrooms and finally spoke in a soft, almost musical voice. She told me they were a doorway to another place, a place where she lived. I laughed, thinking she was playing a game, but she stayed serious, her gaze fixed on the mushrooms. She said that if I stepped inside the circle, I'd be able to see her world. I didn't know what she meant, but something in her eyes made me believe her. I reached out to touch one of the mushrooms, and for a split second, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was still in the clearing, but everything looked different. The trees were taller, their trunks twisted and warped, and the light was dim and eerie. The girl smiled, her face shadowed and strange. She told me I was in her world now, a place where time moved differently, where things could stay hidden for as long as they wanted. I felt a chill and tried to step out of the circle, but she grabbed my arm. Her grip was cold, and her eyes had a gleam that made my stomach twist. She told me that once you entered her world, you could never truly leave. Panic bubbled up inside me, and I pulled away, stumbling backward out of the circle. The next thing I remember, I was running through the forest, the trees blurring past me. When I finally reached home, the sun was setting, and Mom was standing on the porch, looking worried. She asked where I'd been, saying I'd been gone for hours. I told her I'd been playing in the woods, but I didn't mention the girl or the strange clearing. After that day, I tried to avoid the edge of the forest, but sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye. She'd be standing at the tree line, watching me with that same unsettling smile. I'd feel her presence even when I couldn't see her, like she was waiting, hoping I'd come back to her world. One night I woke up to the sound of tapping on my window. I looked over and saw her standing outside, her pale face pressed against the glass. Her eyes were dark and empty, her hand tapping a slow, steady rhythm. I pulled the blankets over my head and tried to block out the sound, but it echoed in my ears, soft and relentless. The next morning I found a small mushroom on my windowsill. It was the same kind that grew in the clearing, delicate and white. I picked it up, feeling a chill run through me. I showed it to Mom, hoping she'd tell me it was just a coincidence, but she looked at it strangely and threw it away without a word. The girl appeared less often after that, but every now and then I'd still see her in the distance, just a shadow among the trees. Years went by, and I grew older, but she stayed the same, always watching, always waiting. I moved away when I turned 18, leaving the house and the forest behind, but the memories lingered. I still dream of that girl sometimes. In my dreams, she's standing in the clearing, waiting by the circle of mushrooms. She calls to me, her voice soft and melodic, telling me to come back, that I belong in her world. I wake up feeling cold, a lingering sense of dread hanging over me. I don't know who or what she was or why she chose me, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that she's still out there, waiting. And sometimes when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can hear her calling my name, asking me to return to the place where things stay hidden and time stands still. When I was a kid, my family moved into an old farmhouse on the edge of a quiet town. The house was big and creaky, with drafty windows and wooden floors that groaned with every step. I didn't mind the eerie feeling that settled over the place to me. It just added to the house's charm. The only thing I didn't like was the attic. The attic door was in my room, right at the top of the stairs. It was an old, heavy door that stuck in the frame, and my parents said it was just a storage space filled with dust and cobwebs, but I always heard noises coming from up there. At first I thought it was just the wind, but sometimes it sounded like footsteps, soft and shuffling, pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as my imagination. One night, though, I woke up to the sound of scratching right above my bed. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked at the attic door. The scratching stopped, but then I heard a faint whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. It sounded like my name. I told myself it was just the wind, that I was dreaming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was up there, watching me through the cracks. The next morning I told my mom about the noises, but she just smiled and said it was an old house, that it made strange sounds sometimes. She told me not to worry, that there was nothing in the attic except some old boxes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else up there, something hiding in the shadows, waiting for me. A few nights later, the noises came back, louder this time. It wasn't just scratching, it was a faint tapping, like fingers drumming on the floor above me. I lay frozen in bed, listening as the sound moved slowly across the ceiling. Then the tapping stopped, and I heard a soft creak as if the attic door was being pushed open. I closed my eyes and pulled the blanket over my head, willing myself to fall asleep. The next morning, I found a small toy on the floor beside my bed, a tiny wooden horse that I'd never seen before. I picked it up, feeling a chill run down my spine. I showed it to my mom, hoping she'd have an explanation, but she just looked at it with a puzzled expression and said she'd never seen it either. She shrugged it off, saying it was probably left by the previous owners, but I didn't believe her. After that, the noises became more frequent. I'd hear whispers late at night, faint and unintelligible, drifting down from the attic. Sometimes I'd hear laughter, high-pitched and eerie, like a child's voice echoing through the walls. I was too scared to tell my parents again, afraid they'd think I was imagining things, so I kept it to myself. One night, I gathered up all my courage and decided to check the attic myself. I waited until my parents were asleep, then tiptoed over to the door and gave it a push. It opened with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase that disappeared into darkness. My hands shook as I took the first step, the wood creaking under my weight. I climbed slowly, my heart pounding with every step, until I reached the top. The attic was cold, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. Shadows clung to the corners, and in the dim light, I could just make out the shapes of old boxes and furniture draped in sheets. But what caught my eye was the small rocking horse in the middle of the room. It was identical to the toy I'd found by my bed, down to the smallest detail. As I stared at it, the horse began to rock slowly, the creak of wood breaking the silence. Then I heard a voice, soft and close, whispering my name. I froze, unable to move, as the voice grew louder, calling me over and over. The rocking horse creaked faster, and I felt a chill settle over me, like icy fingers crawling up my spine. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of a box. I fell, the impact jarring me out of my trance, and scrambled down the stairs as fast as I could. I slammed the attic door shut and threw myself into bed, pulling the blankets over my head and praying that the noises would stop. The next day I asked my mom if we could put a lock on the attic door. She looked at me strangely, asking why, and I just told her that it would help me sleep. She didn't argue, and by the end of the day, there was a sturdy lock on the door, one that I checked every night before going to bed. We lived in that house for a few more years before moving. I never heard the noises again after the lock went up, but sometimes when I passed the attic door I'd feel a chill, like something was watching me, waiting for me to open it again. I never did. To this day, I wonder what was up there, what called my name in the darkness, and why it left me that little wooden horse. I keep the toy on a shelf in my new room, a reminder of the strange things that lurk in old houses, hiding just out of sight, waiting for someone to listen. There was something.